months ago I had this idea for a glittering monument in the sky that this piece would be. And it's another piece for bowed cardboard. Come back to that. So those of you that are here last November had the perhaps dubious pleasure of seeing me talking through one of my earlier pieces for bowed cardboard. And one of the things that I talked about there was my attempts to avoid the explicit modelling of time, and also what a pain in the arse cardboard is to deal with for machine listening, because it's this really kind of sort of sound. And whilst I wasn't working on the piece, but was doing lots of other things, I kept on having ideas, and I had this grand plan. It was so grand that there was going to be this beautiful arc where the computer learned how to re-synthesize cardboard from first principles. It's going to be amazing. Unfortunately, that's not a piece for the technology that I had in front of me. So there was a frustrating few weeks whilst I tried to make something that wasn't actually feasible with what I had. And I got very grumpy, and then I talked to my partner, who's wonderful, and she said, stop kvetching and go and have some fun. So, all right, I'll do that instead. So I adopted what we can call contingently the John Bowers method of attack, which is to go off and make a load of small things and then keep some of them and throw most of them away. So this is the result. I'm not going to say it's the final result because none of my things ever sort of stop being works in progress, but this is probably the top level of what's going to happen tomorrow. If I manage to sort of slap my hand enough between now and going on stage. But I will show you first a couple of videos of some of the ideas that went into it and how I ended up kind of getting the focus that I did. So, where is it? Pitch-driven grains. In fact, the very first thing, doesn't look like I did video, which was I started just taking the output of onset detectors with really low threshold, so they're going mad. Because really the sound of bowed cardboard, when you think about it, it's just a series of onsets, isn't it? Lots of them. And then I used those onset detectors directly as oscillators, with which to ring modulate the harmonic component of the cardboard box sound. So I ran the percussive bit through the out of HPSS into a bunch of onset trackers. They were going, and then I ring modulate the harmonic portion with the idea that I was kind of making the harmonic portion more like the percussive portion by ring modulating it. Alex, you have a puzzled hand up.
Do you just have zeros and ones from your onset detector?
Yeah, I mean, stage B was to do something a little bit more considered and actually measure the inter-onset interval and drive a sinusoidal oscillator with that. Because even for me, using raw clicks was a bit much. And I thought, well, this is fun. Onset detectors are oscillators. There you go. That's part one of my shtick for this piece, which is actually quite similar to using them for CV, obviously. So then I thought, well, if I've made the harmonic component more like the percussive component, can I do the reverse without thinking too hard about it? And the emphasis is very much on not thinking too hard about it. So I did a sort of sample and hold thing. Using zero crossings in the harmonic component, which I reasoned must be coming out slower than the onsets in the percussive component, surely, to do a kind of wave set sample and hold on the percussive material. So it's got a few issues. Unpredictable volume is one of them, but I solved that by normalizing everything as it comes through. Then there was a few other things. Oh, I did have the ring modulator, sorry. I called it amp mod. I sort of like it because sometimes it's very jumpy and sometimes it's doing almost nothing at all. Hey, Rod.
So with the real-time XPSS stuff,
Yeah.
is this, like, are you using it offline on, like, material ahead of time, or are you using that, like, live?
Live. And actually, what I've ended up with in the final patch is basically just squishing the harmonic filter size right down so I can minimise the latency. Because with an sorry, you probably can't see that, with an FFT size of 4096 and then 7 frames of latency, it was lacking a certain intimacy. Like it was 200 milliseconds after I played, which was
What do you have it down to now?
I've just got the filter wanged down to 3, and actually I just stayed at 1024 for the FFT because there's a trade-off. Once you start making the FFT size smaller, it's got less to latch onto.
The feedback.
Yeah. Oh right. That's called I don't want to think about space. Let's just make some. So I've got I've got a sinusoid coming in. I can generate 2 that are 90 degrees out of phase. That's stereo, right? I did actually narrow that. So in the final version, that goes into an MS thing. I stamp on the side signal, so it's not actually just one thing in each channel. So I did think about space a little bit. Tiny. So then I ran around and made some other things which didn't make the cut, but versions of them did. And part of this was an attempt to think about, I decided that I was going to use NMF in my piece if it killed me. There was no particularly good aesthetic or scientific reason for this. I just decided, God damn it, I'm going to get something out of this object. Partly because I was hanging on to this idea of learning something. So they're all variations on a theme, really. That I've got a circular buffer, I'm repeatedly updating a set of learned bases, and then I'm matching some kind of incoming signal. So that one was just taking directly resynthesized components out of the NMF object and using those as grains. Kind of all right. I mean, like, I wouldn't want to listen to 8 minutes and 43 seconds of it though. So that one went on the maybe pile. Then there's one that I really didn't bother recording apparently, where I thought, well, maybe I can cross-synthesize in the spectral domain. If only I can get hold of a reliable phase signal from somewhere, because this is the problem. NMF is just doing stuff on the magnitude, so you need to find the other half of your FFT data somewhere. And that was frustrating because the results have 2 modes. One is awful and one is brilliant. And there's absolutely no explorable territory in between them. So if I applied the phase directly from some incoming signal, it just sounds like you're listening to the incoming signal pretty much. If you start to try and do something quasi-informed about the phase, by which I mean pretty random, it just sounded... so I didn't do that. One thing that I quite like to try as a first stab is to capitalise upon the disagreement of pitch trackers, because it's often quite funny. They never actually tell you the same thing, and of course, you know, pitch is quite a complicated idea. So I made a patch that was so complicated that I couldn't read it the next day, and wasn't actually all that rewarding for all the work that went into it. But it was trying to use points of disagreement between these 2 different pitch trackers as a kind of control signal in its own right, which is something I've done with other stuff. Right. enough of the sketches.
So what
Yeah.
what is the points of disagreement? Can you repeat that?
So the odds of two pitch trackers actually, I mean, I guess if you're actually playing something pitched, they might agree, but who's going to do that? So you can difference them in hertz, that will give you something. You can difference them in cents, that will give you something else. Quite often I'll do both and see what happens. And if they happen to cross paths anywhere, then obviously you can have a little celebration and trigger an event. So there's a lot of throwing stuff away. So the main components of what has survived the cut are the ring mod, the sample and hold thing, some variation on the NMF matching, but actually using entry matcher to do the hard work because that was the chunk that I'm missing. And because I promised that I was going to chuck some ambient sound around the room for part of my piece, I thought I'd better make something. So there's a sort of generator. It generates very good quality, but that's what it's for. Yeah?
And this we can have it, this object, or it's yours personally?
No, of course you can have it. Yeah, it's not. You know, wait until you've seen inside. You might not want it after that. And the main action. Sorry, Rod. This was tidy. Like 48 hours ago, it was beautiful, and then it wasn't anymore. The main action is generating all these different clicks. Lots and lots of different clicks. And packed into this joyous multi-channel audio thing, I'm really digging this new multi-channel thing. Oh, so few patch cables. It's great. There's the harmonic and the percussive in there, so I can just kind of pass them around and then pull them back out and do stuff with them when I need them. These last 5 are basically, in theory and often in practice, pulse signals of different densities, going from very dense and very fast, so almost at kind of pitch territory, through to maybe a pulse every 30 to 90 seconds kind of thing. So PA asked me at some point where the form was going to come from, and obviously from here. I've got things that click at different times, and they don't do so regularly. Again with the disagreement of features thing, I thought, well, if I run lots of different onset detectors, which we now know are oscillators, then the odds of them actually agreeing, particularly if I've set the thresholds to tantalisingly low values, are pretty small. So we've got things happening at different rates. So I hold on to those raw signals just in case I need them. But actually that was a bit too, just a bit too much. I needed to impose at least some semblance of order. Not a very big semblance of order, but some semblance. So I grabbed the paper off the internet, I held it about that far away from my face and squinted, and then tried to code what was in there and made a beat tracker. It's a very simple beat tracking model, which was what attracted me to it. It's basically just a single adaptive oscillator. And if you give it a metronome, it will go tonk, tonk, tonk. If you give it something in very obvious 4/4, it will go tonk, tonk, tonk. Everything else, all bets are off. But this leads to the second epiphany, which is that if onset detectors are oscillators, then beat trackers are filters, obviously, right? So I've got a way of thinning out the number of things that I've got coming through, but also imposing a little bit of regularity if I'm in that mood. So the only parameter that I've exposed to real-time control is basically how jumpy it is. If you pull that right down to 0, it's never going to change its idea about about what the incoming period is. That's it. If you turn it up to 1, every new event is like the start of a beautiful new day, and it will pretty much just track what's coming through. Then, just a bunch of dividers. So you just let every nth pulse coming through. Now, if they're irregular, that would be quite boring, but they're not regular. You're actually, because I've set this to be quite ticklish, you're getting dun 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 dun, the sort of kind of rhythm through there. So throwing away every nth one gives you a different and quite possibly sort of related, slower, irregular rhythm. And I keep doing that. And then at each time scale, they're all getting summed together. And because they're not regular, again, you're generating quite irregular patterns, but they are at least reliable at different timescales. I mean, at this point, I could just press space and go home. I don't even need to do anything else. We could just listen to the clicks for 8 minutes. It'd be great. Anything else happen in this patch? No, there's some nice lights, so I can check what's going on. So that's really, that does some of the structuring work. So again, like Lauren, I'm an improviser. I'm not making a composition here where I'm particularly worried about there being a form that I'm aware of beforehand. I'm making something that I can kind of skitter about on stage. And this is in almost aggressive contrast to the approach that I took in the last cardboard piece, where there was no real-time processing of the sound and all the temporal stuff was on these huge timescales. Here it's very ticklish and very jumpy, and you never actually hear unmediated cardboard box sound. I've gone punk. Alex?
What's the time period on your beat tracker? How long? Because your transient detectors are running very fast.
Yeah, you can set it, so the second argument in there is a minimum duration, so you set an analysis window and samples.
So how long is your analysis window typically?
I think in those ones it's currently like 50 samples or something.
So it's really, it's not really a beat tracker anymore, it's more of a...
Filter. That's what the word you're looking for is filter.
Well, what's a filter? It's a great analogy.
Cheers, Pierre. I knew you'd understand.
But it's, well, you're not filtering out events, you're making new events based on the ones coming.
We've gone beyond events, Alex.
Okay.
Read some Bergson. Come on. Right. So there we go. Rule number 2 was no unmediated live box sound. I'll be there merrily bowing away, but at no point are you just going to hear, unless there's a tiny little bit in the speaker. That's 10 left. Cool. Including the questions. Cool. All right. Well, we can just sort of jump through these. Much of the work was then in kind of plumbing in these time signals in a way that didn't ruin the vibe of all the sweet spots I found. So this is always the problem. You think, hey, I'm going to automate this thing so I don't have to touch it because my hands are full. And then actually you find out that your sweet spots, they're not even contiguous. They're all over the bloody place and they're all tiny. And you spend ages going, oh, all this sort of thing. Most of what's going on is using slower clock signals to decide which of the faster clock signals is happening, and that's then driving some parameters. So in the case of the sample and hold thing, it's basically deciding how many periods it's grabbing for its grain. So it can go from something that sounds almost like going to kind of thing. And then that gets to jump around, not in a continuous way, but in a kind of kind of way. The ring mod is pretty simple, actually. I'm just kind of filtering down the levels of those small clicks, then to drive a small range of choices of things that it can do. So it turns out that there's a really narrow kind of spot where I don't hate it. There was a thing where it's just too excitable and you just think, oh, I've just made mush. And there's a thing where you think, okay, I've just rediscovered the 1950s. And finding that bit where felt like it was flowing a bit with what you were doing and it was going to actually produce a range of different sounds was surprisingly frustrating. I thought that would be the easy one, but it resisted me for a while. Yeah, I was surprised this worked as well as it did actually. So I've got a 2-minute buffer in there, and I run NMF on a 100 millisecond chunk every 100 milliseconds, so moving through the buffer. I update the same basics, so they're changing all the time, thus completely invalidating the entire premise of what I'm about to do, which is to match incoming audio against the point in the buffer that it's already learned. But it hasn't, because the thing that it's learning against has changed. Now this is not controlled directly by the box, but by my beautifully well-shaped mouth. It produces this kind of little bursts of otherwise unprocessed box sound from the last 2 minutes in response to my strained attempts to vocally imitate and sing along with what I'm doing. Or if you just have it on the laptop speaker, it creates a beautiful feedback loop, and then you go home. And then this stretchy thing, very similar idea. I've got a longish buffer, and then it's just basically using information from these clocks to decide really how slowly it's going to crawl through the last 20 seconds of audio and sort of generate sort of thing. And then I split it up into 4 bands using the real-time tracked spectral centroid coming out of first the unfiltered signal, wherever that is, there. And then I split that one in 2 again, and then that one in 2 again. So I've got these moving filters, with a bit of smoothing, because if you leave it to its own devices, the spectral central is going all over the place. But you slow it down a bit, again, you get a sense of jive out of it. And then actually, I just have an extraordinarily slow set of LFOs on all of these, which are being driven by my slowest clock. So that at some point, just the kind of will come up over the course of a minute and a half and then disappear again, and likewise for the other 3 chunks. Then there is actually a ramp, partly because my idea of when to stop is that the DAC will turn itself off after 8 minutes and 43 seconds. And insofar as I'm imposing a shape on it, basically things are going to become more unfettered, more distorted, more silly over the course of the 8 minutes and 43 seconds, so it should be quite by the end, but maybe at the beginning as well. 6 minutes did you say, Pierre?
5 more.
5 more, okay. I could just turn the patch on for a minute if people want to hear the nonsense that it does.
And then take 4 minutes of question.
I'm so glad I made this. This just plays random files back from a corpus of bone dry recorded cardboard that I've got, so I can actually just test stuff a bit without having to, practice. So it might take a little while to wake up until the first sort of clock things come through. Well, it might not do anything at all. Oh no, it is. That wasn't very lively because the clocks weren't jumping very much, which makes me think that I need to go back and retune the thresholds even more. That's partly because it's supposed to start off sparser, partly because it was also misbehaving. When it gets dense, it gets pretty dense. These things here will make some effort to control the density by turning off bits every now and again, but the general rule is there's a lot of unfettered polyphony going on. It's me.
Questions?
Hey!
Is it possible to listen to your clicks?
You can do that in your own time, no? Which clicks do you want to listen to?
Which one?
No, I'm sorry, I was talking about the clock, you know.
Yeah, you want to listen to the clock signals?
Yeah.
If they were working, then I'd be totally into showing you the clock signals. There's a very slow one coming out at the moment.
I saw one.
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
one.
but maybe...
Oh, yeah, there are some coming through.
Yeah, just for...
Just for a minute. Okay.
I can fake some if you want, you know.
Music.
Any other question while Owen is patching this? He's most good at multitasking.
How'd you end?
Well, the DOC turns
Just switches off, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's vision.
Look, it's got a DAC at when the line is finished. We had this statistical discussion around this.
Ah, thank you.
As tight as a singing.
It's